Thank you, Neera. Thank you, Center for American Progress, for not only having me on the board, but allowing me to open this conversation about how we amplify voices and our values in this coming election. I want to remind us that it's not just 2020, it's 2019. In Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky, we're having elections, and we're setting the stage for the future. And while it is said at every single election with the same degree of intensity, these may be the most important elections of our lifetime, given in part that if we don't get it right, soon we won't be here anymore. But I want to talk about who we are. In 2018, as Neera said, I ran for governor of Georgia. I do recognize I am not the governor of Georgia, but I do like to point out something that is true for me and for many in our state, and that is we won. We won by transforming an electorate we were told was static. We won by changing the dynamic and changing the rules of engagement. We won by increasing the Latino vote by 3x in the state of Georgia. We tripled Asian Pacific Islander votes. We increased youth participation rates by 139%. We increased African American participation rates by 40%. And to put that in context, in 2014, 1.1 million voters voted Democratic for the governor of Georgia. In 2018, 1.2 million Black people voted for me. We accomplished this transformation of the electorate by centering communities of color, by talking about marginalized identities, by reaching out to the disadvantaged in all 159 counties, because we have one county per person. We did this by pulling people together and saying that we had a shared vision for the state, but that we understood the obstacles that stood in the way of many. But we also transformed the electorate by doing something we were told could not happen, that if we talked about the demography of Georgia, we were going to ignore and eliminate and exclude the normative white voter who's been the soul and the center of the state of Georgia. But in 2018, I accomplished something no one has accomplished since Bill Clinton. I increased the white share of Democratic votes in the state of Georgia. We were able to do this because we amplified the voices of Georgians who all want the same thing. They want access to health care in a state that's one of the 14 that has refused to expand Medicaid. We increased participation by talking about economic security in a state that still has a state minimum wage of $5.15 an hour. We had conversations with domestic workers and farmers, with tech CEOs, and with startup business owners. We did the work of building a coalition of the marginalized and their allies, yoking them together with union members and traditional Democratic voters, and it worked. Unfortunately, we also have one of the best voter suppression systems in the country operating in the state of Georgia. And that's the challenge, that if we want to amplify our voices and live our values, we have to tackle the single most threatening aspect of our election system, the worst part of what's happening in our democracy, and that is voter suppression. Now, there are those who would discount it. In fact, the Wall Street Journal took time a couple of weeks ago to write an entire editorial page rebuke of my argument. They suggested that because Black and brown people figured out that they could vote, that there could be no voter suppression. They ignored the fact that you can energize communities by seeing them and engaging them and still have those who seek to stop them from casting their ballots. For anyone who would argue that voter suppression is not real, let me tell you about Georgia, where I faced an opponent who happened to be the Secretary of State and decided he should be the scorekeeper, the referee, and the contestant in our race. Over the past 8 years as Secretary of State, he led the purge of 1.5 million voters. He led the closure of 214 precincts. He was responsible for 53,000 people in 2018 alone being put on what's called the exact match system, meaning that if a typographical error was made in your application to vote, you could be prevented from voting. And while ostensibly you should be able to walk up to your precinct and hand them a copy of your application and your ID and say, please let me vote, it was up to volunteers to decide if you overcame the suppression. We lived in a state where African Americans faced the longest wait times in the nation, some up to 4 hours. And if you're making $5.15 an hour and you have to wait 4 hours to vote, you cannot afford to give up a half day's pay in order to cast a ballot. We had under-resourced communities where we had 1 or 2 machines, and we, in fact, had one precinct, one of the heaviest precincts, where they forgot the power cords for the machines. We lived in a state where the Secretary of State was the only one out of 50 Secretaries of State who refused the support of Homeland Security to stop the hacking of our very vulnerable 2000-era machines. And that's just the beginning of what he did. Over time, he not only mismanaged his office, he encouraged localities to underperform. We had absentee ballots that were rejected at an alarming rate, including one county that refused to send out 4,700 ballots. We faced the issues of registration access, and ballot counting, which I like to refer to as Florida. Because it was hard to get on the rolls, to stay on the rolls, to get to your polling place, to receive a ballot, and to have that ballot counted, on November 16th, 2018, I refused to concede the election. Now, let's be clear. I acknowledge the legal transfer of power to Brian Kemp. I acknowledge that he is the legal governor of Georgia. But what I refused to condone was the process that silenced the voices of thousands of Georgians. Voices we know were silenced because we received 50,000 phone calls to our election protection system in a 10-day period. And if 50,000 people knew to call, 50,000 more didn't know, and 50,000 more thought it was their fault. Because that's the insidious nature of voter suppression. It convinces us that it's user error. It convinces us that it's a one-person problem. But it is a system of oppression that is weakening our democracy and corroding our trust in our country. But if you think it's just Georgia, look around. We know that in Wisconsin and in Michigan, voter suppression had a great deal to do with the outcome of 2016. But this is not a faraway problem, and this is not a yesterday's problem. Because in the last 6 weeks, Tennessee passed a law that would limit the access of third-party registration organizations to the registration of people to vote. This is in direct response to 90,000 African Americans being registered by the Tennessee Black Voter Project. And this new law would make it a criminal act to register voters under certain conditions, knowing that the research says that if you want low-income or communities of color to register to vote, it requires third-party action. In the state of Texas, they have criminalized making mistakes in casting your ballot. In the state of Georgia, we had people who went to vote, husband and wife, finding out that the husband was registered in one county and the wife somehow miraculously was sent to a different county. When those women followed the directions given by the registrars, they went across county lines and had their votes nullified. Well, in the state of Texas, making a mistake in 2020 can lead to criminal penalties. And often these criminal penalties will be directly related to language barriers. These acts of voter suppression are not new. They are not unusual. They have been a part of the systemic attempt to push against the demographic changes in our country for the last 20 years. And in case we think I'm being a little hyperbolic, there's a new bill pending in Texas where they're going to eliminate the ability of vans to pick up the infirm, the elderly, or communities of color and take them to the polls. You'll be limited to bringing 3 people, and that you have to get permission to do. That is a pending bill in the state of Texas. In Arizona, they're attempting to roll back access to their mail-in ballot system because too many people used it the last time. When too many people can use democracy, that is a problem. And let us not forget Florida, where 1.4 million ex-offenders, returning citizens, were granted relief from one of the most draconian restrictions in our nation's history, only to now face I was about to say something deeply inappropriate. They now face a poll tax that will strip them not only of their rights, but their dignity. Voter suppression is real and is an external threat to amplifying our new voices. But the call is also coming from inside the House. For those of us who are in this coalition of new and engaged, who are in this pursuit of progress, we have to recognize that the internal threat we face is a fear of who we are. The notion of identity politics has been peddled for the last 10 years, and it's been used as a dog whistle to say that we shouldn't pay too much attention to the new voices coming into progress. I would argue that identity politics is exactly who we are, and it's exactly how we won. By centering communities in Georgia, we not only increased voter participation, we brought new folks to the process. And we have, please. But when we refuse to engage in the conversation of identity politics, when we refuse to acknowledge that we see you and we understand you and we understand the barriers that you face, then what we are met with is a lack of trust. And the very communities we need to show up to engage and to ensure economic security, climate change action, access to abortion rights. When people see that you don't trust them and you can't understand them, they have no reason to engage and no reason to show up. And when I hear Democratic candidates, progressive candidates, American candidates decrying the identities of their voters, I am deeply worried for our democracy. But we also know that our values are lived values, that when our elections occur and when our elected officials do their job, people will engage, solutions will be found. And we know the corollary is true, that if their voices are silenced, if they are not seen and not heard, then the policies that are passed do not reflect their needs. In the state of Georgia alone, where 70% of Georgians say they believe in support of Roe v. Wade and do not want it overturned, we are one of the states leading the nation with these aggressive and deeply unfortunate forced pregnancy bans. Anti-abortion is not the will of the people. Less than 25% across the country believe that we should overturn Roe v. Wade, and yet in Kentucky, in Ohio, in Indiana, in Missouri, in Mississippi, in Georgia, and Alabama, we see these bans moving forward, and it is not a reflection of the will of the people. We still grapple with access to health care, and we still question whether or not the climate is changing, because leaders are being elected who not only reject science, but reject the voices of the people they were elected to represent. But I'm here to tell you there's a solution. It is not, however, having everyone in America run for president. But that is also not an announcement. But my response is this: we have to demand a fair fight in America, a fair fight for the values that we hold to be true, a fair fight for the voices that are pushing to emerge, a fair fight for our democracy to survive. I stand before a group of people who understand that democracy may be resilient, but it is always vulnerable. Look no further than what happened in Egypt. Look no further than what happened in Venezuela. The rise of authoritarian regimes happens when we start to silence the minority and when we take systemic action to limit their ability to reverse the trend. And America is not immune to this. As we watch leader after leader put their signature to laws that limit access, that deny agency, and that undermine the very values we seek to uphold, then we are under threat. But the solution is to fight back. Fair Fight Action was an organization I created on November 17th. I was a little upset on November 16th. And on the 17th, we launched a three-prong attack: litigation, legislation, and advocacy. Litigation, because we have to fight bad law by asking the courts to force good law. It has worked before and it will work again. By having these ballot initiatives across the country that are forcing good ideas, that's an important step, but we cannot ignore litigation. The litigation that forced Hamilton County in Indiana to open up precincts after they moved the one precinct for majority African American communities to the outskirts of town. Litigation that can force the state of Georgia to look at laws that may be on the books but are being manipulated for the sole purpose of denying the right to vote to Georgians. And it's going to work. Just yesterday, there was a decision made by Amy Totenberg, a judge who is looking at our voting machines. And she understands that we have the most hackable machines possible. And now our governor seeks to spend $150 million to purchase what has been called the worst machines in America, the single largest purchase of voting machines in the country. Litigation can work, but we have to fight for it. But we also have to look at legislation. On the congressional level, we have H.R. 1, which has done an extraordinary job of articulating the needs of the people. But in places like Georgia and Alabama, in North Carolina and Texas, we are still fighting for the basic access of legislation. And we know that in Wisconsin and Virginia, I apologize. 1 second, please. This is not a Marco Rubio moment. Sorry. In Wisconsin and Virginia, We know that in Pennsylvania and in Maryland and across the country, we have a fight happening in legislation. Legislation to expand who can vote and legislation to restrict who has access. But that legislation should be met by strong action from the people demanding that their voting rights be restored and that the Voting Rights Act be restored. In the state of Georgia, we were proud to be a part of Marcia Fudge's panel that looks at how we restore the Voting Rights Act across the country and how we expand access to every single voter. But we also have to bring new voices to the table. The internal threat that we face can only be fought back by making sure we have candidates running for office who see everyone, who understand all of us, and who are willing to do the work standing at podiums, but also standing in the streets and pushing people to vote. When we have candidates who look like our communities, we have communities that see themselves and engage. It is a virtuous cycle. The more we engage, the more the people engage, and the more the people engage, the more progress is made. And that should be the goal of every person. That should be the goal of our democracy. We are not an authoritarian regime just yet. We have time in 2019 and 2020 to roll back the stakes and to change our trajectory. We have the ability to call out our values and to stand in those values firm and true. We have the ability to demand better from those who are elected, and if they will not behave, we have the ability to throw them out of office and bring in new voices. That is our opportunity. In 2018, progress won. We didn't win every Senate seat and we didn't win every House seat, but we changed the narrative. We achieved the highest turnout rates in midterm elections in a century. And more importantly, we brought new voices to the table that should remain. I was with Ayanna Pressley yesterday, and she said power should be closest to the people who are in pain. And I will say this, it can be done because it has been done. And whether we have 23, 24, 25, or 150 candidates for president, we should demand from every single person an adherence to the values that we hold to be true. They must speak about voter suppression every day until every person who is legally entitled to vote has the right to vote in the United States of America. But they must also be willing to look every voter in the eye and say, I see you. I understand your challenges. I see the barriers you face, and I am willing to tackle those obstacles, not through vague language and not through opprobrium, but through action, through policy, and through determination. Because when we see our voters and we give them their voices, we will see the change we need in America, and we will survive for another generation. Thank you so much.